In this explainer, we're going to tackle one of the darkest chapters in modern history. We're going to break down how the Nazi regime's hateful ideology didn't just stay as words on a page, but was transformed, step by horrifying step, into a systematic, industrialized program of mass murder.
This is where we have to start, with this number, 11 million. That's the estimated total number of victims, men, women, and children, who were murdered. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around, but it represents the immense human cost we have to keep in mind as we go through this.
So, to understand how something like this could even happen, we've broken this down into 5 key parts. We're going to start with the ideology itself, then trace the path that led to genocide, look at the actual mechanics of the killing process, identify the victims, and finally, examine the lasting scars it left on the world.
To really get the Holocaust, you have to start at the very beginning, with the ideas that fueled it. This wasn't some random act of violence. It was the deliberate, logical endpoint of a deeply held, state-sponsored worldview.
Okay, so at the absolute core of Nazi belief was this concept of Aryan supremacy. Hitler's entire worldview was anchored in this one idea, that a so-called master race, the Aryans, was not only superior to everyone else, but was actually destined to rule the entire world. This single belief set the stage for defining who belonged and, more importantly, who had to be removed.
So this ideological framework was really built on a few key pillars. First, the Nazis declared the Aryan race supreme. And, crucially, they identified the Jewish population as its primary enemy, a threat that needed to be neutralized. Then they used the full power of the state to enforce this racial hierarchy, because they were convinced that the health and purity of the German nation depended on removing anyone they decided was inferior.
Now, this twisted ideology didn't turn into mass murder overnight. As we're about to see, there was a clear, chilling escalation in policy. A deliberate path that led step by step from legal discrimination all the way to systematic extermination.
You can really see it in these 3 distinct phases. It began in 1935 with making discrimination legal. By 1939, it had escalated to a policy of trying to force people out of the country. And by 1942, it reached its terrifying conclusion with the decision they called the final solution. This wasn't a slippery slope, it was a staircase, and each step was taken very deliberately.
The first major step was to actually write this hatred into law. The 1935 Nuremberg laws legally redefined what it meant to be a citizen. They stripped Jewish people of all their rights and even made it a crime for them to marry non-Jews. This effectively made them outcasts in their own country. It was a form of state-sponsored dehumanization.
So by 1939, the policy shifted from just isolating people to actively trying to remove them. The regime's goal was to make Germany and eventually all of Europe Judenfrei, or free of Jews. They actually explored these wild plans for mass deportation, like the infamous Madagascar plan, which proposed shipping millions of European Jews to the island off of Africa. But of course, the war made those kinds of logistics impossible.
And that impossibility led to the most decisive and horrific shift of all. At what's known as the Wannsee Conference in 1942, high-ranking Nazi officials made it official policy. Emigration and displacement were off the table. The final solution was now the state's goal: the complete and systematic extermination of every single Jewish person in Europe.
What's just so terrifying is how the Nazis approached this. They didn't just commit murder, they industrialized it. This part is all about the horrifying logistics and the processes they literally engineered to carry out genocide on a scale the world had never seen. And if you need proof of the regime's top priority, look no further than the railways. Even in the middle of a world war, trains carrying people to their deaths were often given priority over trains carrying troops and essential supplies for the war. It just shows you this ideological obsession that completely overruled military common sense. The extermination project was absolutely central to their entire mission.
The whole killing process was chillingly procedural. Victims were packed into cattle cars and transported by rail for days. When they arrived, a cruel selection determined their fate. The vast majority were sent immediately to be executed in gas chambers, which were often disguised as showers, while a small few were chosen for brutal forced labor. It was a factory assembly line for death.
Now, it's really important to understand the distinction between the different types of camps. While they were all horrific, concentration camps, like Dachau, were mainly for detention and slave labor. But death camps, like Auschwitz, they were something else entirely. They were purpose-built factories of murder, specifically designed for industrial-scale extermination using gas chambers.
So while Jewish people were the primary target, the Nazi vision for this new racial order was far, far broader than that. This section details the many other groups who are also systematically persecuted and murdered.
The scale is just staggering. 6 million Jews were murdered. Up to 1.5 million Roma were also killed, deemed another inferior race. Millions of Slavic people were targeted for extermination and slave labor. Thousands of homosexuals and hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities were murdered, all in the name of social purification and racial health. This was a war against anyone and everyone who didn't fit their twisted ideal.
You know, the end of the war didn't mean the end of the Holocaust's impact. Not even close. In this last section, we're going to look at the profound and permanent consequences that this genocide left on the entire continent of Europe.
The aftermath reshaped Europe forever. I mean, first, there was the massive loss of population. Entire communities were just gone. This led to huge population displacements and migrations across the continent. Old social structures were completely shattered, and nations were forced to grapple with their own cultural and national identities in the wake of such a colossal atrocity.
The simple, stark truth is this: the damage was permanent. Europe's social and demographic fabric wasn't just damaged, it was fundamentally and irreversibly altered. The continent that we see today is, in countless ways, a direct result of this cataclysm.
So we're left with this question, and it's maybe the most important one of all. It's not enough to just know what happened. We have to ask how. How does a modern, educated, technologically advanced country organize its bureaucracy, its technology, and its people to turn a hateful idea into an efficient industry of mass murder? Thinking about that is absolutely essential to making sure it never, ever happens again.